My name is Catherine Monroe. At 10 p.m., I had just stepped off a flight after 7 months working in Africa when I got a call from my mother. Her voice was ice cold. No hello, no how are you? Just one sentence. You don't need to come back. This family already has a hero. Then she hung up. I stood frozen in the middle of a crowd rushing to collect their luggage. It wasn't pain that held me still. It was the feeling of being erased, like I had never existed. Have you ever spent your whole life serving your country only to be disowned by the very family you fought to protect? Have you ever been cut out of the framed photos on the walls of the house you once called home? If you've ever felt forgotten, I hope you'll stay. Leave a comment, hit like, and subscribe. The story I'm about to share may give voice to your own, because the truth, no matter how long it's buried, always finds a way to speak. I remember the day I left West Point like it was yesterday. My backpack was brand new, the straps still stiff with factory folds. Everyone assumed I had quit. In their eyes, I was the first Monroe to walk away from military tradition without finishing the program. What they didn't know was that I'd been recruited into a national-level intelligence operation. One so classified it didn't follow any graduation protocol. No ceremony. No medals under camera lights. Just a mission file and destinations that don't exist on civilian maps. I signed a lifelong secrecy agreement inside a windowless room. After that, I disappeared. Literally. My name was scrubbed from West Point student records. I didn't appear in the graduation list. All official documentation was wiped clean, leaving behind an invisible void in my family's story. A void they quickly filled with one assumption. I failed. No one ever asked. Not a single person. Not because they couldn't, but because they didn't want to. The name Catherine Monroe, the eldest daughter who once led her state's military parade at 17, suddenly became a blank space in the family narrative. When I wrote home once saying I was safe and still serving the country, my mother responded only once, then stopped bringing shame to the family. My father, a colonel preparing for retirement at the time, didn't call. Didn't write. He just passed along a message through my mother. She made her choice. I remember it clearly because my mother repeated that sentence word for word during a call that lasted less than 40 seconds. After that, silence became the language we all spoke fluently. There was one time I got unexpected leave and returned to the base in Kentucky. I didn't tell anyone I was coming. I thought if I just walked through that door without warning, they wouldn't have time to put on that cold, distant face. I was wrong. The house looked the same. The old beige paint, the slightly crooked front door. That familiar mix of citrus cleaner and old paperback books. My mother was in the living room organizing books when she looked up and saw me standing there. She didn't flinch. "How long are you home for?" she asked. 2 days, I replied. She turned back to her task, said nothing else, and continued cleaning like I was a delivery driver who showed up during chores. I walked down the hallway, eyes scanning the photo frames lined on both sides. Emily's graduation photo in a gold frame. My brother in marine dress blues, bowing his head to receive a medal. Their wedding portraits. My father at his retirement, standing between high-ranking officers, holding a certificate. Every picture told a story. I stopped in front of the Christmas photo from when I was 21. I remembered that day vividly. I had come home on special leave for just 24 hours. I wore a navy blue sweater my mother once called simple but put together. I stood beside my father, arm around my sister. But in the version on the wall, I wasn't there. The part of the photo where I had stood had been carefully trimmed out. The frame was smaller now, a perfect fit for the 4 remaining people. The jagged edge where the scissors had slipped was still visible. They didn't replace the photo. They just removed me. As if cutting away a sliver of paper could erase a person from family history. I didn't ask. I didn't lash out. I simply stepped out onto the back porch and sat in the old wooden chair where I once memorized my first speech for basic training. I let the breeze move through my hair, trying to remember what it felt like to belong somewhere. That evening, during dinner, I asked my father, "The hallway photo, who cut it?" Without looking up from his plate, he said, "Your mother thought the frame needed adjusting." Not a pause. Not a flicker of hesitation. My sister looked at me, lifted one corner of her lip. "You shouldn't have shown up unannounced. Everything was calm and then you came back like a ghost." That sentence pierced deeper than any weapon I'd faced on deployment. I ate in silence. Looking around that table, I knew I was surrounded by people who shared my blood, but no longer remembered my place in theirs. They didn't have to disown me. They just had to pretend I never existed. That night, back on base, I unlocked my personal locker and pulled out the commendation pin I'd received after leading a successful rescue mission near the Syrian border. A mission no news outlet ever reported. I held it in my palm, not for pride but to remind myself, I don't need recognition. I am who I am, whether I appear in the photos or not. I drove nearly 10 hours across 3 states, not because I expected a warm welcome but because a part of me still wondered, would they even recognize me as family? Or was I just a wrinkle in memory someone wanted to smooth out? I arrived at their front gate around 9 in the morning. My father's SUV was parked under the maple tree, my sister's car beside it, clean with fresh tags. The beige house with its weathered roof looked exactly as I remembered, but I was no longer the girl waiting to be called inside. I pulled my suitcase from the trunk, straightened my collar, and climbed the front steps. I hadn't warned them. Partly to see their real reaction. Mostly because I no longer owed them an explanation. I rang the bell. No one came. I rang again. Still silence. Finally I pushed the door. It wasn't locked. The house smelled of orange spray and old wood. My mother was in the kitchen, wearing a crisp white blouse, arranging napkins neatly on the table. She glanced up at me. No surprise. No emotion. Not even the awkwardness of seeing a daughter after years apart. Just a cold stare and a clipped sentence, like I was early to a party I wasn't invited to. Don't wear your uniform. Quitters don't deserve it in this house. I didn't respond. I simply set my suitcase against the wall, where my old drawings once hung. That space was now a solid oak shelf lined with Emily's photos. Graduating from West Point, accepting awards, standing with fellow officers in Texas, glowing with the light everyone seemed to reserve for her. I touched one photo gently. In the corner, a hand rested on her shoulder, partially cropped. No face. But I recognized it. One of the few pictures I still remembered clearly. And I had become nothing more than a hand cut from the story. My mother kept folding napkins. Her tone was firm even. Guests arrive at 11. Wear something plain. Don't draw attention. Don't embarrass her on the most important day of her life. I nodded quietly and walked to my old room to change. It still smelled like old pillows and HB pencils, but the sheets had been replaced and every trace of me was gone. On the desk sat a brand new perfume box, a sealed lipstick, and a gold-foiled card that read, "Welcome home, Captain Emily Monroe." It wasn't my room. It was Emily's now. I opened my suitcase, reaching for the neutral blouse I had packed. But my hand froze on a thicker, stiffer fabric, the ceremonial dress uniform I had never worn in front of them. I touched the embroidered silver star on the shoulder. A star I earned on a mission that only 3 people alive could confirm. I didn't need them to validate me. But I didn't need to hide anymore either. I changed in silence. When I came downstairs, the navy jacket was folded over my arm, a white shirt and gray slacks replacing any need for approval. Not a uniform. But not an apology. Emily was already in the room. My sister. Radiant, petite, confident. Her uniform perfectly pressed, medals aligned. People surrounded her, offering praise, handshakes. When she saw me, her eyes flicked for a split second, then returned to that flawless smile. She gestured toward me as she addressed the officers beside her. "This is my sister, Catherine. She served for a while, then changed paths. Works at the VA now, helping veterans fill out forms and stuff." That sentence was delivered with such polished grace that it almost sounded sincere. A carefully crafted narrative, designed to avoid offense while ensuring I wouldn't outshine her spotlight. I heard a few polite murmurs. One blonde woman holding a champagne flute whispered, "That's wonderful." A whole family in service. Everyone contributing in their own way. I just smiled. I didn't say a word. Didn't correct her. I didn't need to. Some truths don't require speaking. Sometimes just standing still, quietly and firmly, is enough to make people uncomfortable. The reception began with course after course of food being served. Emily moved gracefully through the crowd, receiving congratulations and smiling as if she were born to live beneath stage lights. I was seated at the auxiliary table, alongside a few aides and a newly commissioned cadet. That was fine. I had long since grown used to being sidelined. Only this time it didn't sting anymore. There was just a quiet stillness inside me, hard to put into words. I sat calmly, watching the room as if I were observing a play I once starred in, but had now been cast as audience. The lively conversations, the polite touches on the arm, the glances exchanged between officers of rank. It was all choreographed perfectly to elevate one person. When I stood to get a glass of water, an older man in a navy uniform looked at me and asked softly, "Where did you serve?" I turned to him with a slight smile. "In a few places that don't show up on official maps." He raised his eyebrows a little, then slowly nodded. He didn't ask another question. But in his eyes I saw something, an unspoken understanding I've only ever seen in people who've truly been there. I returned to my seat with the glass in hand. And I felt like I still existed. Not in my sister's introduction. Not in my mother's approval. But in the silence, the solid presence of someone who had seen and understood. Without needing to say it, because it couldn't be denied. The promotion ceremony took place in the main hall on base. The same hall used for officer retirement farewells, military weddings, and nameless moments of remembrance. That morning, sunlight poured in through the towering windows, casting light across rows of seats arranged meticulously by rank. I sat in the very back. No name tag. No reserved chair. A folded program printed on recycled paper rested quietly on my lap, the bold heading reading, Lieutenant Colonel Promotion Ceremony, Emily Monroe. Her name was centered beneath a slanted line that read, "In honor of unwavering commitment and loyalty." No one spoke to me for more than 30 minutes. A few glanced over, but no one asked my name. None of them knew the places I'd walked, places not found on any public map. They just saw a woman in a simple blouse, hair neatly tied back, sitting straight, eyes focused. When the music stopped, a coordinating officer stepped up to the podium. His voice rang clearly as he welcomed the audience, acknowledged the distinguished guests, and finally announced Emily's name with formality. Lieutenant Emily Monroe, nominated for promotion to lieutenant colonel. Applause thundered through the hall. I remained seated. Not out of envy, but because I had learned to clap for others. Those who survived, those who were lost, and those never mentioned on stage. Emily walked up to the podium as the military anthem faded. Her hair was pinned flawlessly, her uniform tailored to every seam. She stood under the spotlight and began her speech with a steady, confident voice. She thanked her superiors, her comrades. Everything was composed, appropriate. Until the tone shifted. "My family," Emily said, lifting her gaze to the audience, "has served for 3 generations. We don't hesitate. We don't walk away. In military culture there is no room for wavering. We do not honor those who quit. We honor perseverance and loyalty." I could feel multiple pairs of eyes turn toward me all at once, like a soft but unmistakable wave. I didn't lower my head. I didn't flinch. I kept my eyes forward, fixed on the stage. I didn't look at her. And I didn't release the slight clench of my hand resting in my lap. Then the back doors of the hall opened. Footsteps echoed, cutting through the low murmurs. A tall man entered, silver-haired, upright, polished shoes gleaming. His deep green uniform adorned with rows of medals. No one had to introduce him. I recognized that stride, that posture, those eyes. General Hamilton. He had stood beside me for 8 months during counterterrorism operations in Jordan. He was the man who had ordered missions with me on moonless nights, who once looked me dead in the eye and said, "I'll let you make this call. And I'll carry the consequences with you." He paused in the center aisle. Heads turned. Emily hesitated mid-sentence, her words faltering. General Hamilton didn't greet anyone. Didn't look for a seat. His eyes scanned the room and then he marched directly toward the last row, where I sat. I didn't stand. I just looked at him. He stopped 3 paces from me, heels clicking together in perfect formation. His right hand rose to his temple in a sharp salute, flawless and precise. "Major General Monroe," he said, voice clear and firm enough to carry across the entire hall. "It's an honor to see you again." The room went silent. I heard the soft thud of Emily's note cards hitting the floor. A colonel near the podium straightened instantly, jaw set in surprise. A few whispers began. "Major General? Who is she? Is that the commander from Syria?" I stood. Not with haste. Not with pride. just steadily, eyes locked with his. I returned his salute. Not because I had something to prove, but because I wouldn't let him stand alone in a room full of people who once had no idea I existed. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my mother sit upright, her face pale. My father leaned slightly forward, lips parting like he meant to speak but didn't. Emily gripped the podium, her gaze scattered, composure cracked. General Hamilton gave a brief nod, then turned and walked to the front row, where someone hurried to make room for him. I sat back down, silent, but no one dared look at me with dismissal. They didn't know the whole story. But now they understood one thing. The woman in the last row was not a supporting character. And in that moment, silence weighed heavier than any truth buried for too long. I left the hall after the ceremony without looking back. Not out of arrogance, but because I knew in their eyes now I was no longer someone they could size up by rumor. But just as those glances began to shift, something else arrived, quiet as a crack beneath the tiles. A brown envelope had been placed on the center table in the officer guest quarters where I was staying. No one knew I was staying there. No one had access except base management. I didn't overthink. I just paused, resting my hand on its edge. No return address. No insignia. No seal. Just a heavy stock envelope, standard issue in most military facilities. What made me hesitate wasn't how it looked, but the silence it carried. I opened it. Inside were 3 crisp sheets of paper. Nothing but text. The subject line stopped me cold. Operation Eclipse. Misconduct and civilian casualties. Whistleblower submission. And the rest of the content made my spine stiffen. It was a copy of an anonymous email sent to an extremist military blog based in Nevada. One known for publishing leaks and inflammatory reports about combat missions and internal scandals. The email accused me by name, Colonel Catherine Monroe, of authorizing an operation in 2017 that resulted in the deaths of at least 7 civilians, including 2 children. It read like a criminal indictment. It emphasized that the mission had been carried out without regional command approval and alleged that I had covered it up by altering the mission report. I didn't need to read any further to know exactly what I was holding in my hands. This content, almost word for word, came directly from the classified operations report for Operation Eclipse. That report had only been read by 3 people. Me, the lead analyst, and a communications officer from the battalion-level intelligence team. The analyst retired last year due to health reasons. The communications officer was Emily. I dropped heavily into the wooden chair beside the table. Scenes from the morning ceremony rewound in my head like a tape. Emily's words at the podium, her eyes dodging when General Hamilton saluted me, the sound of her speech notes slipping from her hand, and finally, that smile she gave me throughout the reception. So perfect I wanted to believe it was real. I looked again at the printout. There it was, an excerpt straight from the Field Situations section of the report, a section I had written myself, detailing the enemy's position near a civilian village and the decision I made when our unit was surrounded. In reality, that decision saved 14 soldiers and 5 civilians who were evacuated in time. But here, it had been twisted into reckless action leading to unnecessary casualties. I remembered that night at the forward command post writing the report. I spent 6 straight hours typing it, line by line, detail by detail, leaving out neither names nor coordinates. That report was never made public. It never appeared in any civilian database. And now it sat in front of me, in the hands of someone trying to turn it into evidence of wrongdoing. I folded the paper and carefully slid it back into the envelope, locking it in my desk drawer, then spent a long time rinsing my face in the bathroom. The cold water didn't cool the burning in my chest. I wasn't angry. I wasn't shocked. I just felt heavy, like part of me had known all along that someday my sister would do this. The only question left was, why? I thought back to a winter day in 2018. I'd run into Emily at a rest stop on the Northern Carolina base. I had just returned from Stuttgart after 2 months overseeing coalition training operations. She was standing with a group of young officers telling jokes. When she saw me, she paused for a beat. Then walked over, smiled, and asked, "So what are you up to these days?" I answered simply, "Still drifting around." She gave a soft laugh, her eyes flashing something I couldn't quite pin down. "Yeah. I think maybe you should settle somewhere for once. A career that quiet seems like a waste." At the time I thought nothing of it. But now it felt different. Emily had never handled comparisons well. When I enrolled at West Point, she quietly told her friends she didn't like rigid environments. When I got selected for intelligence, she announced to the family that she'd be joining a combat unit, not hiding behind a desk. And when I disappeared from family photos, she was the only one who never asked why. I understood now. My absence made her feel safe. My silence gave her the freedom to create a new version of me, a quitter, a paperwork clerk. And now, after a 4-star general publicly saluted me in front of a full auditorium, the world she spent her youth building had started to crack. An email like this, if handled strategically, could be enough to reopen an internal inquiry. Enough to stall my advancement on any promotion lists. Even enough to jeopardize my high-level clearance at international strategic conferences. I sat quietly in the room, fluorescent light casting a pale glow over strands of graying hair. The old round clock on the wall ticked softly. I didn't have solid proof, yet. But I had memory, data, and experience. And most importantly, I had the truth. I stood, locked the door, retrieved the envelope from the drawer, and placed it in my leather satchel. Tomorrow I'd start tracing the origin of this email. But tonight I had to accept something I had avoided for years. That the deepest cuts don't always come from enemies. They come from the hand that once held yours crossing the street. The next morning, I submitted a formal request to open an internal investigation. It was brief. No emotion, no reference to rank or reputation. Just one line. Potential breach of sensitive data relating to Operation Eclipse. Source origin must be confirmed to ensure system security. I knew that a request like this from anyone else would land at the bottom of the stack. But I wasn't just anyone. General Hamilton approved it within 2 hours. Late that afternoon, I was summoned to command headquarters. He wasn't seated behind his desk like usual. He stood by the window, arms crossed, eyes on the distant training field. When I stepped inside, he turned around and got straight to it. "I'm authorizing you to lead the investigation," he said evenly. "But there's one condition. To avoid any perception of internal bias or personal leverage, the investigative team will consist of individuals directly linked to the records and equipment involved. And, unfortunately, most of them are in your family." I stood still. Not surprised. Not protesting. "You can decline," he added. "But if you don't lead it, someone else will. And I don't trust anyone to understand this system better than you." I nodded. "I'll take it." The first meeting took place 2 days later in a small conference room inside the Technical Security Coordination Wing. White walls, gray wood table, metal chairs covered in old faux leather. A thick binder sat at each seat labeled as classified. I entered last, carrying a military intranet schematic, a real-time access route map, and a black coffee, no sugar. My father sat at the far end on the left. He wore a white shirt, pale blue tie, posture as straight as if he'd never left the service. In front of him was a stack of old operation files, worn at the edges. He didn't look at me when I entered, just nodded slightly. My mother sat beside him, glasses perched on her nose, hair pinned back, dressed like she was still in the clinic. In front of her was a laptop already running trace software and a few labeled hard drives. She looked up at me, lifting her chin, not cold, not warm. Just the look of someone determined not to let feelings interfere. Emily was the last to arrive. Full uniform, hair perfectly tied, not a strand out of place. She sat across from me, opened her laptop and plugged in one earbud. Her screen displayed an interface for tracking unauthorized access logs. She didn't say a word. I pinned the network schematic to the whiteboard. The room fell into stillness. I began. "We're dealing with a potential classified data leak." The email in question quoted directly from the Operation Eclipse report, a report seen by only 3 people. Myself, a retired analyst, and one currently active officer, Lieutenant Colonel Emily Monroe. No one reacted. I continued. "We're not here to draw conclusions yet. Our objective is to identify the access point, the path the email took, and any data transfers involved. Unusual behavior will be documented but not judged until verified." My father opened his folder and said flatly, "I'll recheck the mission logs from 2016 through 2018. I still have limited access through my reserve advisory account." My mother didn't look up, just nodded. "I'll focus on timestamp metadata from legacy devices. especially the secondary servers tied to related campaigns. If there's unauthorized access, the log parser will find it. Emily said nothing. I turned to her. Lieutenant Colonel Monroe, what will you be reviewing? Without looking up, she replied, I'll scan all access logs from the past 3 months. I'll trace every connection from internal IP addresses to outside servers, especially encrypted or masked intermediaries. Will you agree to share all relevant access credentials with the team? He nodded coolly. I have nothing to hide. The air in the room thickened, like dust layered over a wall no one wanted to clean. The meeting lasted nearly 3 hours. No small talk. No laughter. Each sentence dropped like a stone into still water. No ripples. As I closed my laptop, I looked around the room. No one here is looking for praise. And no one here is on defense. We're here for the truth. And I won't accept anything less. No one responded. We left the room almost at the same time. Down the long hallway, only the echo of our shoes remained. My father walked straight to the parking lot. My mother stopped at the elevator, turned to me and said in a very quiet voice, It's not just jealousy, Catherine. Sometimes people will do anything just to be seen, even if it means making someone else disappear. I didn't reply. I just nodded, then walked away. Evidence doesn't lie. No matter who sits behind the screen, no matter how they scrub access logs, alter timestamps, or use temporary accounts, the system always keeps one thing they never expect: internal cache signals. At exactly 2:13 a.m. on March 4th, a personal device logged into the legacy archive at Communications Station 3, the very place Operation Eclipse files were temporarily stored before being transferred to the encryption vault. I traced the device. The identifier didn't match any shared servers. It belonged to a workstation temporarily assigned to Emily Monroe during her training support rotation at Fort Bragg. I didn't need anything more. That evening, after the system shut down for maintenance, I walked down to the parking lot near the tech wing. A cold southern wind swept through, carrying the scent of scorched plastic and damp soil. Emily stood by her car, pulling her bag from the trunk. Yellow light from the overhead lamp fell across her shoulder, muting the nameplate on her uniform in the fading dusk. We need to talk, I said, my voice calmer than I expected. She turned slowly, like she had been waiting. No surprise. No attempt to pretend otherwise. I handed her the printout of the access trace. She glanced at it, then looked me straight in the eye. I sent it, she said. Her voice wasn't raised. It wasn't defensive. There was no nervous smile. No apologetic look. Why? I asked. You knew it was a classified report. You knew it was dangerous, illegal even. You knew what would happen if it spread. Emily let out a soft breath that almost sounded like a laugh. Of course I knew. I looked at her in silence. I didn't feel anger anymore. Only a still, choking quiet. She continued, I just wanted you to disappear. Not because I hated you, but because even when you weren't around, you were still the shadow people mentioned. You were gone for 20 years, but every time someone praised me, they'd still say, she's great, but her sister, that one was really special. I said nothing. Didn't react. I just stood there, listening to words I never thought I'd hear from the little sister who once clung to me every morning on the way to school. I didn't do anything wrong, she went on, her eyes glossy but no tears fell. I followed every rule, passed every test, finished every drill, obeyed every protocol. But I was still just Catherine's sister. You could vanish from the house, from photos, from dinners, but you never left their memory, their comparisons, even their silence. I took a deep breath. And you thought sending that email would make it stop? I didn't think that far, she said softly. I just wanted, for once, when people heard the name Monroe, they'd look at me, not at some name buried in a classified file. I nodded slowly. Not in agreement, but because the curtain had finally been pulled back. You know, I said, some choices once made can't be taken back. I'm not sorry, Emily replied, raising her chin slightly. I know it was wrong. But I'm not sorry for finally saying out loud what I've been carrying for 20 years. I stepped closer until I stood right in front of her, close enough to see the loose strands of hair across her forehead. No one's wrong for feeling overshadowed, I said calmly. But they become wrong when they choose to weaponize that pain to destroy someone else. Emily said nothing. Her lips pressed into a thin line. I pulled a folded copy of the military indictment I hadn't yet submitted and handed it to her. I haven't turned this in. No one else knows yet where the breach originated. But if you think I'm going to let you smear me again, you're mistaken. She took the document, looked at it, then at me. For the first time in our entire conversation, something flickered in her eyes. Not anger, not resentment. Fear. I turned away, walking toward the dorm entrance, but spoke loudly enough for her to hear. You have two choices. Either I'm the one who clears the red flag from your record, or I'm the one who signs your disciplinary file. You decide. There was no reply. Only the sound of her car door closing behind me, and a breath that dissolved into the night air. But I knew that after tonight, no one would ever say Emily Monroe was just someone else's shadow again. Because the price of hiding in the dark is that sometimes, the truth gets exposed by your own hand. I spent the entire next day buried in the base's network analysis center. The soft blue glow of monitors lit the focused faces of security analysts lining the walls, each absorbed in rows of scrolling command lines. I didn't sit with them. I chose a separate desk, one that allowed access to deeper systems, accessible only to those with prior high-clearance intelligence credentials. I began with Emily's access data. Her login matched the exact timestamp of the anonymous email's transmission. But what stood out, the data trail didn't end there. A strange piece of code appeared shortly after her device connected to the system. An IP string completely separate from the internal network, encrypted with non-duty standard algorithms. I expanded the trace. The address was routed through 3 layers of proxy, but the third had a timestamp error, just enough of a flaw to pull the entire route back to its origin. And the name that appeared in the final log made my heart tighten. Delaney.J, active override attempt. Jack Delaney. That name wasn't unfamiliar. In 2017, during Operation Eclipse, he had been one of the strategists assigned to diplomatic coordination and logistics oversight. He had proposed expanding the perimeter by air, even though the area was flagged for potential civilian presence. I had pushed back. Hard. I had just been granted command authority. I didn't yield. And soon after, he disappeared from the strategy unit. They said he was reassigned. But I knew he had been pushed out. By a woman who made a firmer call than he did. I thought that story was over. But this time he hadn't returned for debate. He came back with a plan. I opened the script embedded in the anonymous email sent to the military blog. The encryption was basic, but inside it was a call-out line. A return function that pinged a secondary server. The kind of code used in cyber warfare to manipulate data remotely. If Emily hadn't reopened the old archive, the code would have never triggered. But once she accessed the system, the script activated, pulled the cached mission data, and forwarded it to the external server. When the email was sent, the content had already been drafted, by Jack Delaney himself. Emily wasn't the author. But she was the tool. A pawn. I leaned back in my chair, eyes fixed on the screen without really seeing. My mind wasn't on the lines of code anymore. It was on Delaney. That seasoned face, the calculating eyes, the cold smile of a man who knew just how flexible moral boundaries could be when bent hard enough. I turned to the security console, entered a priority query chain, and requested a 6-month log of any device accessing the system from IPs linked to Delaney. 3 minutes later, the results came in. One of the devices matched the exact login time from the night the data was exposed. It was an old workstation once assigned to Delaney. It had supposedly been decommissioned after he left his post, but it was still sitting in the backup data center, root access unrevoked. I left the analysis room quickly and headed straight for security coordination. The duty captain saw me and stood immediately. Major General Monroe? I need a search order for device code 9A117. Immediately. That device is still passively logged into the system and may have been compromised with external malware. He hesitated. Ma'am, according to records, that device is sealed in Vault 4. No retrieval authorization has been filed. Well, now one has, I replied. Activate trace and report directly to the top secret intelligence office. Red level clearance. Hours later, as I and the tech team scanned the entire device, we found exactly what I expected. A spyware program disguised under the system file name, sysbackup, had been quietly collecting access logs from every user who'd touched that network. Every access related to the Eclipse files had been recorded and relayed to an anonymous server in the central United States. And from that server, only one command had been issued over 3 months: send email. Delaney hadn't aimed just to hit me. He waited. Waited for Emily or someone else in the unit to unknowingly reopen the door he had left cracked open. And once that happened, he used it to redraw the truth on his terms. I returned to my temporary office and sat alone beneath the desk lamp, staring at a map of access chains. I pinned Delaney's photo above the map, alongside his old personnel file. Part of me felt relief. Emily hadn't been the sole architect. But another part felt a chill. Because if someone like him had resurfaced, then this attack was only the beginning. This was no longer about two sisters. This was a chessboard. And the person who said it wasn't from my family. It was someone who had once been outplayed and returned not to debate but to settle a score. He wasn't attacking me directly. He was exploiting the fractures I had refused to face for over 2 decades. I invited the whole family to the old house in Kentucky on a Sunday afternoon. Not at base headquarters, not during a conference, and certainly not in a briefing room filled with data charts. But in the place where everything began. The house was older now. Porch roof peeling, the front door slightly crooked, hinges squeaky. But to me, it was still the silent witness of all the words left unsaid. I arrived early. Reset the dining table. Placed each chair where it once belonged. My mother's. My father's. Emily's. Mine, the one no one had remembered where to put for years. My father arrived first. He wore a gray sweater carrying a thin folder. He said nothing as he entered. Just looked around, surprised to see me setting the table like it was a regular family dinner. My mother came a few minutes later holding a small foil-wrapped dish. "It's that old stew you used to like," she said softly, placing it down. I didn't respond, just nodded. Emily came last. She wore civilian clothes, her hair down instead of neatly pinned. Her eyes looked tired. But she didn't avoid mine. We sat around the table. No one touched the food. No one reached for a glass. I started speaking, slowly but without hesitation. I didn't call this meeting for apologies. And I'm not here to blame anyone. I just want, for once, to tell everything. In my own words. My father looked down at his hands, fingers interlaced. My mother leaned slightly forward, listening closely. I pulled a stack of documents from my bag. A copy of my first deployment order into the intelligence program. The mission report from Mosul. Photo stills from a body cam during the prisoner extraction along the Syrian border. A handwritten debrief filed from a bunker after the ambush in Kunduz. One by one I placed them on the table. I was there, I said. Not in the photos. Not mentioned in the news briefings. But I was there. I walked them through each mission. Not to prove myself, but to restore the truth. I told them about the time I had to choose between holding a position or retreating to rescue a trapped unit behind enemy lines. About declining a medal because its publicity would have collapsed a fragile diplomatic treaty. I told them about the mistakes, the sleepless nights, the commands given between heartbeats and gunfire. My mother brought a hand to her mouth, her eyes wet. My father said nothing, but I saw his shoulders tremble just slightly. I didn't cry. Not once. My voice only cracked at the end. I chose silence. Not because I lacked the courage to speak, but because I thought if I did the right thing, the recognition would come on its own. I was wrong. Silence is never rewarded. It's only mistaken for absence. I turned to Emily. She was looking at me. The sharpness in her gaze had softened, like she was seeing me for the first time without the lens of comparison. I slid a copy of the original email across the table to her. The one sent anonymously to the military blog, marked with system traces proving her device had been exploited as the relay. "I don't need your forgiveness," I said. "I just need to be acknowledged, as someone who truly existed in this family." Emily didn't speak. She lowered her head, her shoulders shook faintly, but no sound came. After a moment, she simply nodded. My father was the first to speak. "I used to think silence was how we preserved honor. That when someone in the family took a different path, it was best to let them go. No questions. No chase." He paused, voice deepening. "I was wrong." He looked up at me. "I never asked where you were going. What you were doing. And when you sent flowers to your mother, sent Christmas cards, I stayed silent. Because I still saw you as the daughter who left tradition behind. I didn't realize it was my silence that pushed you further away. My mother wept. She placed her hand over mine. You never disappeared, she said, voice shaking. I chose not to look. Because I was afraid that if I really saw you, I'd realize I'd missed the greatest part of my life. I gently squeezed her hand. None of us spoke for several minutes after that. We simply sat there, around a table growing cold, meals untouched, and truths finally laid out like empty plates. No decorations. No introductions. I never needed forgiveness. I never had. But today their gaze, direct, honest, no longer turning away, told me I had been seen. Not as a shadow but as a person. With everything I had carried for years, now placed openly before them. No more hiding. No more silence. I returned to Fort Bragg at the beginning of fall, when the leaves started to change and the morning air held the promise of things about to shift. This time I wasn't arriving under orders. I wasn't carrying classified mission files. I came back as a senior strategic advisor for the Joint Operations Command, with a special focus on non-traditional warfare strategies, an area becoming more critical by the day in a world where conflict no longer obeys borders. The class was held in a small hall on the east side of the base. The room wasn't large, but it fit more than 30 mid to senior level officers, people who had been in the field and were now returning to learn how to see war not just through maps and coordinates, but through psychology, culture, and social systems. On the first day, I stood in front of the board, pausing a few seconds before saying my first words. Not because I was nervous, but because I realized this wasn't the beginning. It was the place where certain cycles had finally closed. Emily sat in the second row near the window. She arrived on time, didn't glance around, didn't make small talk. She opened her notebook, took out a pen, and sat in silence. I didn't mention the past. I didn't look at her any longer than I looked at anyone else. I taught the way I had learned to teach, with clarity, precision, and complete respect for each person sitting in front of me. We discussed post-conflict community crises, the psychological erosion of soldiers deployed in gray zones, the idea that a failed strategy often isn't wrong, it's just used at the wrong time or by the wrong people. I shared intervention models I'd applied, not from textbooks or slides, but in cramped rooms in Kunduz, the dusty alleyways of Al-Hasaka, and negotiation tables framed by gunfire along the northern border of Mali. At the end of each class, I always left 5 minutes for questions. Emily was never the first to raise her hand. But when she did speak, her questions were sharp, clear, and often left the room quietly contemplative. One time she asked me, in an operation where every decision carries moral risk, how do you know if you've chosen the right one? I answered without hesitation, you don't. But you must be willing to take responsibility for the choice you make. She nodded, slowly taking notes, asking nothing more. A few weeks later, as the course shifted to operational analysis, I received a thick binder from Emily. The cover was neatly printed, outlining a proposed reform model for battalion-level officer training. The content was sharp, in-depth, and written in a voice that was both intellectually rigorous and deeply personal. I read it from cover to cover and found no fluff. She had understood. Not just the knowledge, but the spirit behind the decisions that had once kept me awake for months. The cover didn't have a long-winded title. Just 3 centered words in capital letters. General. Sister. Teacher. I paused. Not because I was surprised, but because I understood that for Emily, placing those 3 words side by side wasn't just about respect. It was acknowledgement, something I had never had in that house. That afternoon, I saw her standing just outside the classroom, coffee in hand, eyes on the training field in the distance. I walked over, stood beside her, and we stayed silent for a few seconds. The proposal is excellent, I said. If implemented, it'll help younger officers better understand the nature of leadership in asymmetric environments. She nodded slightly. I didn't think you'd accept it. I turned to her. Why not? She was quiet, then said softly, because I thought you'd erased me from your life. I exhaled, no smile, no sadness. Just a steady tone. I don't need an apology. But I do need to know you understand why I stayed silent for so long. Emily turned to look at me without the weight in her eyes. I do. And I'm learning from you. A little more every day. I nodded. There was nothing more to say. A month later, the proposal was selected for pilot testing. I was invited to serve as academic advisor. Emily was assigned as co-developer for content. Each week we worked together, no longer as sisters, no longer guarded. Just two former soldiers, once lost in silence and rivalry, now learning how to rebuild trust through knowledge, through work, and through small, ordinary things, like being called by the right name in the right place in someone's heart. I never needed applause. I never needed medals or ceremonies. But moments like these, when someone's gaze changes, when their tone no longer hides its edge, those were what I had been missing all along. I'm sharing all of this not to stir pity, but to remind anyone listening. Sometimes, even in the families that seem the closest, indifference can make you feel invisible. But the truth, if you're brave enough to face it, always offers a way to step out of the old shadows and stand upright on your own feet. I don't know what you've been through in your own family. Maybe you've been compared, overlooked, or spent years trying your hardest only to be unseen. If that's the case, I understand. And I'd like to hear from you. What part of this story struck the deepest chord? Leave a line below. Maybe no one else will read it, but I will. And if this feels like a small corner where you're reminded you're not alone, follow the channel. There are more stories coming. Stories of imperfect families, of broken parts stitched back together, and of people, like you and me, learning to move forward not with regret but with truth.